Welcome. In this final episode on our first unit, we will conclude with a study of the Northern Renaissance. First, I want to differentiate. The Italian Renaissance took place in northern Italy, but that is the Italian Renaissance. Many students get that confused because it's in northern Italy. We refer to that as the Italian Renaissance. The Northern Renaissance is the moving of Renaissance ideas out of Italy into other parts of Northern Europe, England, France, even to Spain, Germany, the Low Countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, those areas. Why did this happen? What caused it? Well, first, there's always a gradual spread of ideas through human movement and through trade. But a major spark that sets it off are the Italian Wars, which begin in 1494 with the French invasion of Italy. You also saw the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who led counter wars. Rome was sacked. Many of the cities and city-states in Italy were weakened. And so many artists, many writers fled from Italy to other parts of Europe, as Italy, all throughout the early 1500s, was kind of a war zone. And so, again, the Renaissance continued in Italy there, but it also spurred many to leave and to take up residence in other parts of Northern Europe, where they brought their ideas and artistic style with them to those new countries. Many monarchs of the European states were also beginning to patronize these artists and hire them as court artists for the king's court in order to bring a layer of competition and sophistication and their artistic style to their castles and palaces and churches and city squares. How was the Northern Renaissance different from the Italian Renaissance? Well, for one, it took place in Northern Europe instead of Northern Italy only. It took place a little bit later, but a few key other differences. The Italian Renaissance had a major classical influence versus a major theme present in Northern Renaissance was called Christian humanism. Whereas in the Italian Renaissance, remember, many of the themes were very Christian and very church based, but they also had that major sort of classical and humanist influence. Christian humanism is focused more on Christian piety, where there were many who were critical of the church, but they're not at all generally separatist, or like the coming period of Luther and the Reformation. There's no desire to separate from or demands to separate from the Catholic Church, but there is a sense that there were corruptions in the church and there were problems, and that they wanted a return to Christian piety. And maybe one way to think of it is this idea that, prior to the Renaissance Reformation period, there was an extreme emphasis on the afterlife, right? That folks preferred, basically, there was a strong acceptance of suffering. And, some might criticize it and say indifference to human suffering. But in this Christian humanism, there's this idea that the tenets of Christianity should be applied in such a way as to make life on earth better and less of a suffering experience for more people, and that took a front seat in the way people experienced the church in that time. How else was it different? Remember that the Italian Renaissance was heavily sponsored by these merchant families, where they were very rich, they were traders and businessmen, but they were not monarchs or kings. And so in the Northern Renaissance, more often they had a smaller merchant class, but they were sponsored and patronized by kings. The Northern Renaissance also kicks off with the development of the printing press. Now, the printing press had originally been adopted from China. The trouble is, the Chinese language with its characters is not very well suited to easy use by the printing press. And so in Germany, it was adopted by Johann Gutenberg, and we'll take a look at a printing press, for example, what they're able to do is take these small metal letters, lock them into a frame, and then you're able to press this down after being slathered with ink on these pieces of paper, and you could very quickly, maybe not by our standards today, but very quickly, compared to writing out every page by hand, you could print paper and reproduce words, pictures, whatever, very, very quickly. What does that lead to? That leads to actually more education, more literacy, cheaper books, more widespread books, more diverse opinions, many critical opinions, and you see a revolution in learning. Really, not until the development of the internet in the last 20 years would you really see a revolution on this scale in learning, as the idea that going from a world where everything in print was handwritten to a world not that many years later where everything was machine printed is a dramatic revolution in learning and opens reading and writing to so many more people, whereas it had previously been a single book might cost more than a poor person might ever make in their whole life. They would never be able to afford a book. They were priceless virtually. And so that's a dramatic change. And you also see the popularity of woodcuts. What that is a form of art very famous by Albrecht Dürer, where, so this is the paper reproduction, but what an artist like Dürer might do is carve their art into a piece of wood, making lines and indents and things, and then you slather it with ink and you press it down in the paper. And today we'd think of this like photocopying an image, but this was brand new. Previously, if you wanted to have even any type of work of art, you either had to be really, really rich or be an artist yourself, versus now with quick and cheap reproducible woodcuts, paintings and reproductions, or at least art in this form, was available to many, many more people. Let's see. And now moving on to the emphasis on non-nobles. Not only is it accessible, right, because more people could read or read ideas or view the art of the Northern Renaissance, they were even the subjects of the art, as we'll talk about today with Peter Bruegel, who we've actually talked about in the previous video. And to conclude the unit, a brief highlight of a few of the outstanding people of the Northern Renaissance. One is Jan van Eyck, a Dutch painter who was, we believe, the first to sign his paintings. We had that image the other day of Giovanni Arnolfini and his bride, where he signed his painting, Jan van Eyck was here, up above. And we also believe he was the first to use oil paints, which today there are many more different types of paints, but at the time this was a breakthrough in the ways that they could blend color and paint, that he was among the first to use oil paints. Albrecht Dürer is one of the most famous German artists of the Northern Renaissance. He's very famous for his woodcuts and many, many religiously themed works of art, again, especially those woodcuts, which were broadly reproducible. And again, very famous for that self-portrait, the one where he looks a bit like Christ as he paints an oil painting of himself. Peter Bruegel, also an oil painter and a Dutch, I believe Flemish technically, it's in the region of Belgium and the Netherlands, painter. And he was unique. They often called him, rather than by his name Peter Bruegel, they nicknamed him Peasant Bruegel because of the propensity he had to make peasants, ordinary people, the theme of his art, which was relatively unique coming out of the time period. Desiderius Erasmus was a famous humanist writer, also, I believe, from the Netherlands. And he very famously wrote on all sorts of topics and was critical of the church and mocked inconsistencies and problems and abuses in the church, though he sought reform and not any type of break or revolution or reformation that would come in the coming decades, but it is said that Erasmus, quote, laid the egg that Luther hatched, that Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation and the revolution that brought in Christianity was essentially laid by people like Erasmus, who criticized the church in the decades before Luther. And lastly, Sir Thomas More, the humanist writer. He was an English writer, author, statesman. He wrote several books, one called Utopia, from the Greek word for no place, or a place that doesn't exist. So any utopian, or in today's, it's more common to have dystopian literature, a place that seems perfect but actually has grotesque problems that exist beneath the surface. That's a popular writing and film genre today, is the dystopian literature or film. And really we owe that to Thomas More and his book Utopia. He meant it very sincerely and tried to do a book about a place that genuinely would be perfect, even though it involves several impossibilities, and basically that human beings would be better than we are and treat each other better than when we do, and the place would be perfect, but perhaps admits that it basically will not exist on Earth. He also wrote a book called The Defense of the Seven Sacraments. Henry VIII, his king, wrote it, but it was kind of ghost-written by Thomas More as a book of a rebuttal to Luther. This would all be very controversial in the decades to come, because his king would actually sort of turn on this and sour in his relation with the Pope in Rome and with the Catholic Church, and would actually have Thomas More beheaded and executed for not supporting his break with Rome enough. And that concludes our trip through the Northern Renaissance and a discussion of the advancement of the printing press and how significant that was. And finally, this concludes our introduction unit, Unit 1, as we've looked at an introduction to modern world history through the lens of understanding how and why the world is the way it is. And so we have looked at a brief overview of the ancient world, the First Age of Man, a brief overview of the medieval world, or the Middle Ages, Second Age of Man, and we're using this Renaissance period, this Italian and Northern European Renaissance, as the hinge, the event that marks the break from that Second Age of Man, the Middle Ages, to the modern age. And that is the Renaissance, and that concludes this video. Thanks for watching.